This is part 3B of my workshop on the Gospel of Thomas that was originally presented in the year 2009. Now we need to look at the Kabbalistic constitution of the soul, because in order to understand the teachings about death, we have to understand what the Kabbalistic ideas were. These are very ancient concepts that are still alive today in Jewish Kabbalah, and that we will find in many other religious streams as well. These are the parts or the divisions of the human constitution. There's the basar, which is the mortal flesh or the meat or the physical body that decomposes after death. That's what goes back to the Elilim or the demons. Then there is the nephesh. That's the mortal personality. It's your lower animal nature, your astral and sidereal body. It's composed of subtle ethers that survive death for about 40 days and then dissolve back into their subtle elements in a second death. So after a person dies, his personality is still awake and alive, but it's a temporary situation. It contains the mortal mind, the perception, the personality, the gender, individuality of the deceased. It speaks the language of the deceased. It is the personality. It's probably derived from the Egyptian Ka, and possibly the Kaibit. The Ruach is the spirit that is released when the Nephesh disintegrates at the second death, about 40 days or 6 weeks to 7 weeks after physical death of the body. This is an androgynous substance of the divine Olam. It's probably derived from the Egyptian Ba, which is always represented as winged. But spirit is the matrix that connects the physical and the non-physical. It's the matrix that connects the earth and heaven. And it's not so much a body. You see, the flesh, basar, is the body to the nephesh, which is the interior part. But then the nephesh is the body to the soul, which is called the neshama. The ruach is a matrix that connects them. The neshama is the soul that is incarnated at birth and survives death for purgatory, Gehinnom, or Gehenna, and paradise, Pardes. It's the immortal and divine body for the Yahida. So we have the soul, so to speak, or of the flesh of the body is the nephesh, the personality. The soul of the personality that is immortal and is a spiritual being is the neshama, the individual soul. But the neshama is also the body of a higher kind of soul called the Yahida. Now, this soul, this neshama, can be defiled or it can be sanctified by the activities of the nephesh, of the personality in life. It's probably derived from the Egyptian Aku. Now, the chaya is the higher mind. It's the spiritual nous. For example, the Hermetic Greek term nous, we find it also in Paul's Gospels. Or understanding. That's the higher understanding. It's not your discursive mind. It's your spiritual mind. It's the mind, so to speak, of Christ. It's the mind of the neshama that can experience the vision of God. Paul referred to it as the nous of Christ, the mind of Christ. It's probably derived from the Egyptian Sahu. It's the divine personality of the purified soul, or neshama. So it's on the higher aspect, the personality of the immortal soul, just as the nephesh is the personality of the mortal body. And finally, there is Yahida. The Yahida is the highest aspect of the human subtle constitution. Now, it's through the Yahida that a Zaddik, or realized saint, could achieve divine union with Godhead. It's possibly derived from the Pythagorean Greek monos, the monad. Unlike the monad, which was a neuter term synonymous with Godhead, Yahida is a Hebrew feminine term. All these terms are feminine. Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yehida, all the spiritual aspects or the spiritual principles of the human constitution are feminine with respect to Godhead. The divine soul of the Neshama is the Yehida. It is feminine to Godhead, who plays the masculine part to it. The masculine aspect of Yehida is Yehid. When you have a divine marriage, Hyros Gamos, of the individual spiritual being and God or Godhead, you have the marriage of Yehid and Yehida. You have the marriage of the Lamb. You have the wedding of Messiah. These feminine aspects, which are beyond our physical reality, Kabbalistically, the flesh and the personality were considered to be physical and metaphysical. That is, the flesh was what we would call etheric. The nefesh, the personality was etheric. It was not immortal. It was composed of the more subtle elements of the earth sphere, so to speak. The nefesh was, when it came into incarnation, when all these higher principles came into incarnation into human flesh, and the nefesh was formed then through experience through life, and contained in it other kinds of things that would be determinative about its life, because it contained in it all that had been retained in the heart of the previous incarnation, good and bad karma, so to speak. The nefesh would be formed through the juxtaposition of the planets and the zodiac and the zodiacal houses. In other words, the moment that the nefesh was born and took its first breath, just as in Greek astrological theory, would form certain characteristics in the nefesh that would remain. So whether a person would be musically talented or fat or thin or etc., even male or female, would be determined by that moment of birth, because before that time the being is androgynous. So let's take another way of looking at the ancient Kabbalistic spiritual bodies. The flesh and the nefesh, as I said, are physical or quasi-physical. But the neshama and the chaya and the yakida are all spiritual beings. The matrix in which they dwell is ruach, spirit. So the basar is the physical flesh of the body. The nefesh is the personality, which we might represent with this aura like this, the personality. Those things are both mortal. When the physical body dies, the neshama, the nefesh, will continue to live for a certain amount of time, but it cannot live without vital force, and finally, without its vital force, it's going to disintegrate. The soul, the neshama, I'm representing by this halo around the head. It is the soul of the nefesh. It's the immortal soul. The chaya is the mind of that soul, and yehida is the highest aspect of these spiritual principles. So that's another way of looking at all this. Now I'm using this graphic that was developed by a guy who was a scientist, became very interested in occult things and so on, and he did a lot of work, and now he has become kind of a guru himself. But much of what he teaches is not in line with the teachings of Yeshua, and as a matter of fact, I really don't like what he teaches and how he goes along with it. But I did like this graphic, so it's a nice way of representing what the Kabbalistic self is. Here's the physical body, the basar, the flesh. The nefesh, or the personality, the lower mind, and the astral and sidereal body, and so on, are embedded in that physical flesh, and those things are both mortal. The neshama, or the soul, stands behind all this, but what kind of communication is there between the nephesh and the soul? If the nephesh, if the personality, is not in communion with its own soul, then it goes off on its own and follows its own desires, and usually they are selfish desires, egoistic desires, and it gets itself into more and more trouble, and it accumulates bad hub, bad debt, and so on. So it's very important for the personality, the person in flesh, the actual being, to make a communication between its lower mind and its higher mind, between its soul and its personality. So we can't really say that we have a soul. We should say that the soul has us. So that would be one way of understanding it. Now here is the matrix of spirit. This represents the spiritual matrix that that contains the soul and is the matrix of the soul and of the neshama and of the chaya and of the yahida. And I'm representing it here in this kind of way. And as you can see, there is a communication, and I like this because it stresses a communication between the immortal soul and the higher self, the higher nature. The higher self was known among the Greeks as the algo-ides, the radiant self. But this is not something that incarnates. It's a step away from the soul, and so the soul has to also make its connection with Yahida. And so in deep meditation, one will be connecting or attuning one's own lower mind to the chaya, the higher mind, and one's own nephesh to one's own neshama, one's own soul. And the soul will be connecting through the chaya, the higher mind, to the yahida. And that would be the highest divine connection. So the higher mind, or nous, or mind of Christ, I'm representing with this little circle around this this divine being up here. And the yahida, the divine self, what might be called by the Pythagoreans the individual monad, is represented in this way. Now, it's not far-fetched to look at Pythagorean and Hermetic thought in its relationship to Kabbalistic, because in Babylon, when Kabbalistic thought was strongly developed, the biggest influence next to the traditions of Egyptian mortuary science that people had remembered and kept were the traditions of Pythagorean science and astrological science and Hermetic science that were known throughout the ancient world in the wisdom schools, and their books were read, and there was a lot of intercommunication between the wise people of different traditions, and this happened especially in a very sophisticated place like Babylon. So there were, as Gershom Scholem, the great Jewish scholar, has said, we probably can attribute an awful lot of Kabbalah to the Pythagorean system of number, letter theory, and so on. So let's take a look at my Kabbalistic soul, just to get this comparison. Here's me. Here's my flesh. I'm sitting in the back of my CNC 34 sailboat, sailing down to Mexico, down to La Paz, which I just did very recently. I sailed my boat 1,500 miles down there. Enjoyed myself. So here I am in my flesh. That flesh is not going to stay around real long. That flesh is going to die, and it's going to disintegrate, and it's going to be gone. That flesh is something that is changing all the time. If you take pictures of me when I was 2 months old and 5 years old and 12 years old and 30 years old, they don't look at all the same, do they? It's constantly changing. This is the flesh, the basar, which is the clothing for the nephesh, the developing personality, which in turn influences how the flesh is going to look and be, and so on. Now here is my nephesh. Here's my personality. That's my lower mind. That's my sex, my gender, my education, the language I speak, my opinions, my various ideas, and so on. That also is going to die. It's not going to die at the same time my body dies. It's going to die after my body dies. It's going to hang around. It can actually be contacted by spiritual mediums who are very sensitive. It's kind of like a computer program that's sort of lying around before it disintegrates. What is more, in this, what has been called sidereal or astral body, it's called a body because it is actually the body for the soul, the neshama. I can be anywhere I want to at any time because I'm just ahead, I'm just in my mind. Plato, when he represents the incarnation of the soul is first a sphere. It's just basically a head, a face, and then it grows appendages that it needs to be on the earth and so on. Well, this is the backwards of that. This is just the head. This is what a neshama is. It's basically a mind or a construct of intelligence, of lower intelligence. It can be in some somewhat good or in some somewhat evil. Now, if I have not made a strong connection in my physical life between my lower mind and my personality and my higher self and my higher mind, if that is a broken connection, if it's not very strong, then one kind of thing is going to occur with me. My soul will have become somewhat defiled. It will be in need of purification. If I have made a strong and good connection with my higher self, and if I have walked my talk and talked my walk and been the person on the inside that I am on the outside and vice versa, and if I had tried to implement the ways of Godhead, of justice, truth, compassion, and so on in my life, then I have another path in front of me after I die. Because all this represents what's going to remain of me after my body has died and my neshama, my astral personality, has dissolved. In the first place, all that I am after that, I no longer have one sex. I am androgynous. I no longer am constricted by gravity and by physical forces and things like that. I'm constricted only by the limitations of my own soul and my own mind. Now, this is representative of the neshama, or the soul. It's just a head and it's winged. All of these are spiritual beings. All these constituents of me are now spiritual beings. They're made of an entirely different substance than anything that's material. It's a matrix of spirituality, and this is the soul. And this is the chaya, the higher mind that I have, that is the personality, like the nephesh of that soul. And this is the divine spark, the yahida, that is the ultimate divine part of me, that is part of that original divine light that we can only visualize as light, as Godhead is the root of all reality, the fountainhead and source of all being. And that individuality is what I have. Now, this divine spark, this yahida, is not, you say, oh, well, it's all light, it's all just a mass of indistinguishable blur. No. Each yahida is an entirely different personality. It's a divine personality. There are no two of them that are exactly the same. They're all quite different. And so you have to understand, even though to us it's just a I've represented as a little sort of radiating white light. It's a very different kind of personality. It's a fully realized being, just as it was emanated from Godhead in the very beginning. Now, if I have been incarnated from that Yehida, the Yehida is that which initiates incarnation. The Yehida emanates the Chaya, the higher mind. It emanates the Neshama, the soul, and then those emanate my my personality and my flesh. Now, the Yehida makes a connection when all things have been developed and a saint has developed and his higher mind and his lower mind are merged and his soul and his personality are merged and his actions and thoughts are made one. They are made single. He's no longer divided and so on. And that has been exercised in life through the thoughts, words, and deeds of life. Then it is possible that the divine spark, the Yehida, will merge with that which existed before existence, the Zelem, the divine Zelem, which we call the Yehid, in a Hieros Gamos, or divine wedding or divine marriage. And that is what we represent as Yahweh, as Godhead, etc. And when we achieve the union of Yehida and Yehid, then we have achieved the highest thing that the human expression can achieve. So this is a quick and dirty look at Kabbalistic idea of what the human being is and what the constitution of a human being is and its various souls and levels of soul. So understanding all that, we can understand now much better the sayings we're going to look at that speak about death and after death. Here's Logian 112. Woe to the flesh, because it depends upon the soul, but woe to the soul if it depends upon or clings to the flesh. So remember I said we don't have a soul, the soul has us. But if we rebel against the soul so that we're not very well controlled, and even though we are in fact dependent upon the soul, but we don't recognize that, then we take our soul captive. So woe to the flesh, because it depends upon the soul. The flesh does depend upon the soul for its existence. But woe to the soul if it depends upon the flesh. If you invert things, where all of a sudden the child becomes the father. Literally it says, woe to the flesh that depends upon the soul, and woe to the soul that depends upon the flesh. But I've translated it and paraphrased it in a way that makes it more understandable. The neshama can be either sanctified or defiled by the works of the nephesh in life. And flesh is emanated from spiritual principles, and it thus depends upon the soul. But the nephesh can ignore and defile the soul, and thus woe to that soul. Now here we have an example of a nephesh that clings to a dead man, his flesh. Here's a soul depending on flesh. He doesn't want to die. He's afraid to die. His nephesh hangs around his body. His nephesh is in a terrible state of mind and so on. This is a spiritually undeveloped person in death. But a spiritually developed person, like Yeshua, releases the body easily. Remember that people were amazed how quickly Yeshua died. He just let himself go. And in a spiritually developed man, the nephesh is released and completely released. The the Kabbalistic ideas that we find in some of the wisdom literature, like the silver cord and the golden bowl and so on. These are all representative of things uh, that connect the body and the soul, the body and the nefesh and the soul, and so on. Login 87. The personality of flesh, that is the nefesh, that clings to flesh, that's basar, will waste away, and the soul, that's the neshama, that is attached to these two will become desolate. Well, this is a bad outcome. Literally, what it says is shattered is the body that clings to a body, and shattered is the soul that is attached to these two. There are people or there are personalities who, after they die, they're very materialistic. They're afraid of death. They don't want to enter into any kind of a judgment, or which is actually a purification. And they cling to the body. They cling to the things they understand. It's often said that the more people prolong their mourning and their agony of somebody who has passed, the more they cause that person to be unable to pass, unable to go on to the next stage. Hamlet's father was, in Shakespeare's play, is poisoned. Poison is put in his ear while he sleeps. He does not have a chance to be shriven by a priest. Not that it would have done him any good. But and so he dies in an unsanctified state, according to the church theology. And so his ghost hangs around and can't go any farther. He can't enter into peace until Hamlet takes vengeance upon those who have killed him. Well, this is a pretty this is not Kabbalistic. That would not be the way to lay a ghost or to release a ghost. But this is what tortures Hamlet, and this is the fact that the injustice that was perpetrated on his father. And the great injustice is not just that he was murdered, but that he was murdered in an unsanctified state, that he was not allowed to prepare for death. And so therefore he was stuck. He's sort of like the ghost of Marley. He's stuck by these chains of negative activity that he committed all during his life, and they hold him down and don't let him go anywhere. Well, so this is one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that the nefesh, that the mind or the personality that is spiritually undeveloped and very materialistic and very egoistic, is going to, one way or another, eventually dissolve. And when it does, it will completely lose its continuity of consciousness if it has no spark of spirituality in it. So shattered is the body that clings to a body. The body is the nefesh, which is the body of the neshama. And shattered is the soul that is attached to these two. Well, something bad can happen to the soul? Yes, it can. Yeshua spoke about losing a soul, the loss of a soul. What that means is we're going to try to make plain in a little while. The case of one who is divided or is se'ef, or disconnected from his higher realities, is the example of a person who whose nefesh is going to cling to flesh or material things or his life and the things that he knows and the things that he understands, and it's going to have ramifications for his soul. Here's a personality. I happen to use a mugshot of Charles Manson here. But we're going to talk about someone who is definitely disconnected from his higher principles. Someone who is, capable of murder. Someone who's quite evil in many ways. Has made himself quite evil. He's defiled his soul in many ways. His nefesh will try to avoid the second death by draining vital force from living beings through obsession or possession. The demons that Yeshua and other exorcists exorcise came from many sources. They can come from animals, they can come from elemental spirits, and they can come from dead human beings the dead nephesh of human beings who are trying to maintain their consciousness by draining vitality from other people. This is the old story of the Lamia, the vampire. This accumulates a great burden of hub, or spiritual debt, or sin. But nevertheless, that nephesh is one way or the other going to eventually disintegrate, like it or not. It might not be after 40 days, it might be after a year and a half, but it's going to happen. So the nephesh will eventually dissolve, but any continuity of consciousness will be lost. Now the soul, or neshama, will suffer many weeks of purifying fire in the Gehenna of the third heaven. Now remember that in Jewish Kabbalistic thought, the absolute limit of time that anyone could spend, that the soul could spend in Gehenna, that is what the Christians call hell, was 1 year. And usually most people would spend most souls would spend far less time than that, because the fires of Gehenna are allegorical for a kind of introspection that goes on where one looks in horror at his own flaws and sees himself for what he really is and has been. And that is the only way one becomes aware enough to try to avoid these things in the future. And this is compared to fires of things, but it's not a torture; it's a purification, and that was the idea of the Jewish Gehenna. It was a form of purification of the soul before the soul could enter into Pardes, the paradise, for either its sleep, its rest, in the case of a not very spiritually developed person, or for one who was worthy of the Kima, the resurrection, that person would be awake in the Pardes. It had to pass through Gehenna. It has to pass through some form of purification of the soul. So in the case of a person very consciously evil, the soul will have to suffer many weeks of purifying fire in the Gehenna of the third heaven. There's the east of heaven and the west of heaven, and one side is Eden and the other side is Gehenna in the third heaven. The third heaven is the first spiritual heaven. The other two are the day heaven and the night heaven, which are the physical heavens, which will dissolve and no longer exist at some point in the history of the universe. But these heavens are eternal. Then after his soul has been purified for whatever the amount of time it takes, up to a maximum of a year, it will fall asleep in paradise. It cannot awaken in the Chema. It will just be asleep. And then it will be reincarnated. It'll have peace. The immortal Yehida will then emanate another physical incarnation through the neshama, through the soul, but this new incarnation will be burdened with the hub that remains from the previous incarnation and face a difficult path in life. It's just like karma. So let's see if we can take this path through this Logian. The discarnate personality, the nephesh, or the so-called astral or sidereal body, dissolves back into its etheric elements about 40 days after death to release its higher spiritual principles. It's called the second death. So here I have portrayed that graphically. The Devar says that just as the flesh dissolves after death, the nephesh that clings to flesh will also dissolve regardless of how much it tries to avoid it. The soul, or neshama, of a spiritually dead person, that is, a person who in life had never experienced or was never really spiritually alive, that soul will be left desolate without a conscious connection. So there is no continuity of consciousness, and the nephesh has never picked up the divine aspects of the higher nature. So that soul is lost. that soul is no longer connected in any kind of way to anything through consciousness. Yeshua said, "What profit it if a man gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" And that is what soul loss is. In the case of a person who is grossly materialistic, grossly egocentric, and egotistical and selfish, and thereby does things that are selfish and wrong in life, and then tries to do everything he can to avoid the second death, his personality actually dissolving in death again, that death will still come, but it will come in a hard way, and there will be much purification of the soul just in order to admit him into the pardes, and he will have basically lost his soul. He will be at square one and have to start again with the whole burden of sin. In the case of a true disciple, however, his consciousness will withdraw into the neshama through the sulam, or the heavenly staircase of ruach, or spirit, because spiritual integration has been accomplished in the works of incarnate life. So this would not be something that one who is spiritually alive would experience. So Yeshua's statements about not experiencing death and so on are related to these Kabbalistic ideas of death. Logian 88. The angels and the prophets will come to you and give you those things you already have, and you will reciprocate by offering them those things which you have, and say to yourselves, when will they come and take what is theirs? Whoa. Well, this is all these logia from 83 to 88 preserve aspects of Yeshua's Kabbalistic teachings about death, and that's why they're mnemonically organized, and the person who is reciting these teachings orally originally, he remembers them like this because they were all about this subject and this topic. But this is in the case not of a person who is spiritually dead when he's alive, but a person who makes himself totally spiritually alive in flesh, in his body. In other words, the disciples. So Yeshua is telling his disciples what they can expect after death. It refers specifically to the after-death realities that a saint will experience. So he prepares his disciples for the reception in heaven, or in pardes, after death. And he's telling what's going to happen. Now you have to understand the Near Eastern convention of gift giving and receiving. In the Near East, when one was a guest and entered into another's home, he was given gifts, food, drink, hospitality, and perhaps other gifts. He must then reciprocate by offering gifts to the host. So that was the convention, and that's what this is allegorizing here. The angels and prophets will come to you and give to you those things you already have, and you will reciprocate by offering to them those things which you have. And then you'll say to yourself, when will they come and take what is theirs? So something is strange here. They come with gifts and they offer it to their host. Rather, they come with the gifts and the host gives them all kinds of gifts. Then they offer what they have to the host, who accepts it but never comes and collects it. What's going on? And you will reciprocate by offering them those things which you have, and say to yourselves, when will they come and take what is theirs? Well, by the same token, when a disciple is welcomed into the body of the Bar Enosh after death, he will be given gifts, just as Adam, Kadmon, was given, quote, marvelous endowments from a great heavenly host. These are sovereignties. These are gifts, are kingships, rulerships, sovereignties, etc. What is it that the disciple has to offer? What are the gifts that he has to offer? Well, these are the things that he has stored up in his heart. These are the things that testify for him, the good works. So these gifts or rulerships or sovereignties are based on what they already have, what they already possess in their hearts. That's the basis of what they're going to receive. Those who have will receive. Them as has gets. To him who has, even more yet will be given. But to him who does not have, Even what he has will be taken away. These are all sayings that relate to this idea. Now, what can the disciples offer? They can reciprocate only by offering the treasure that they have accumulated in their hearts. But the angels and the prophets of heaven do not come to accept the treasures. Why do they not come to accept the treasures? I'm sure they're very hostily, and they thank them very much for offering what they have. But the Abba and all those dwelling in the eternal Olam do not lack. That's a term that's used in both Gnosticism and Kabbalistic thought. They have no need. They have no lack. They don't use anything. You can't give them anything. You can't give them gifts. Yeshua said, it is better to give than to receive. It's better to be a giver than a receiver. Why? Because the giver is the one who does not lack, and the receiver is the one who does lack. So, because the heavenly beings do have no need of the gifts, so to speak, the treasure that is in the heart of the disciples. The treasure in the heart of the disciples is what has earned them their reward, their malkuth, their sovereignties, and so on. Then that's why the disciples say, well, when will they come and take what is theirs? When will they come and take the gifts I'm offering? So you can see this is very allegorical, very Kabbalistic, and it is could only be understood by understanding the Kabbalistic background of that Yeshua is speaking out of. Otherwise, it's completely incomprehensible. Now, we want to talk a little bit about the Kabbalistic robe of glory and the Gnostic robe of glory. When Yeshua said, if God so clothed the grass or the lilies of the valley, how much more will he clothe you? He referred to the Kabbalistic robe of righteousness. Joseph's coat of many colors was the basis for this Kabbalistic interpretation, this Kabbalistic allegory. And one received his malkuth, or his sovereignty in heaven, having become a fully realized saint and a member of the Bar Enosh, of the new humanity, or the heavenly humanity, and the new Adam. That person was clothed in a robe of righteousness, a robe of glory. It was a splendor, robe of splendor. These are Kabbalistic terms that we find from the 32 paths of wisdom in the Kabbalistic tree, all the names of Godhead. Now, this concept first appeared in the Babylonian Trito-Isaiah, the part of Isaiah that was written by the school of Isaiah in Babylon after the Babylonian captivity. In Messianic interpretation, this would become the raiment worn by the Tzaddikim, the saints of the Chema, the people who achieved the resurrection. Trito-Isaiah says, I will greatly rejoice in the Lord, my soul shall be joyful in my God, for he hath clothed me with the garments of salvation, he hath covered me with the robe of righteousness, as a bridegroom decketh himself with a garland, and as a bride adorneth herself with her jewels. So this is the root of this idea of that one receives a robe of glory as well as a crown of glory when they overcome and they become saints after death. Paul's spiritual body, his soma pneumatikon, represents an early Christian adaptation. When he talks about, he says, well, there's a physical body and there's a spiritual body. And he compares the physical body to the seed, and the spiritual body to the tree that grows and blooms and develops out of that seed, that has a form that's entirely different than the seed. So that is one of the ways that was adapted in early Christianity from the Kabbalistic allegory. And all these were Kabbalistic antecedents to the Gnostic multifaceted royal robe of glory, which we're going to look at because it is one of the places that develops the Kabbalistic idea of the robe that Yeshua was talking about when he said, if God hath so adorned the lilies of the field, how much more will he adorn you, O etc. The hymn of the pearl is found in the Acts of Thomas, which is Thomasian literature. It describes the perfected soul's return to heaven after successfully completing its mission to recover the pearl, or the original divine identity that has been lost in the bondage of fleshly incarnation. As he ascends after death, the Gnostic saint and the Kabbalistic saint, his robe of glory rushes to him and envelops his soul. I'm going to read a little from J.R.S. Mead's translation from the old Syriac text in his book called The Hymn of the Robe of Glory. You can get this online at this particular location. The glorious robe, all bespangled with sparkling splendor of colors, with gold and also with beryls, chalcedonies, and iris-hued opals, with sards of varying colors to match its grandeur. Moreover, it had been completed with adamantine jewels. All of its seams were off-fastened. It was seamless. Moreover, the King of Kings' image was depicted entirely, or all of it. In other words, it was a robe of light. And as with sapphires above, was it wrought in a motley of color. I remember this, there's a sapphire ocean and sapphire sea before the throne of God. I saw that moreover all o'er it the motions of gnosis abounding. Now the motions of gnosis would be the chaya, or the higher mind, the motions of higher thoughts, which are understood to be praises and prayers of God, and so on. I saw it further was making ready as though for to speak. I heard the sound of its music, which it whispered as it descended. So its speech is not human speech, it's in chant and in music and in song. Behold him the active in deeds, for whom I was reared with my Father. That's the robe is now singing to the soul that is ascending. Behold him, the soul, the active in deeds, the one who is good in his deeds, for whom I was reared with my Father, with my Abba. I too have felt in myself how that with his works waxed my stature. As the person completed good works and did good works on the earth, his robe of glory grew in heaven. It's something like Thomas's idea of the King Gangdophorus, who hires him to build him a beautiful palace, because Thomas, like Yeshua, was supposed to be a Freemason. He was supposed to be an architect. But instead he gave all the money to the poor. When the king wanted to see what he had built, he said, the great palace I built you is in the heavens. It is in heaven. Your palace is in heaven. It's a heavenly thing that I have built for you. And the same thing with this robe of glory. And now with its kingly motions it was pouring itself out toward me, and made haste in the hands of its givers that I might take and receive it. And me too my love urged forward to run for to meet it, to take it, and I stretched myself forth to receive it. With its beauty of color I decked me, and my mantle of sparkling colors I wrapped entirely over all of me. I clothed me therewith and ascended to the gate of greeting and homage. I bowed my head and did homage to the glory of him who had sent it, whose commands I now had accomplished, and who had too done what he'd promised. That's the concept of a covenant. And there at the gate of his house, sons, I mingled myself with his princes. For he had received me with gladness, and I was with him in his sovereignty, his Malkuth. I was a co-sovereign with him. Now, one other thing I want to emphasize is the importance that Yeshua laid on non-attachment. It's a Buddhist ideal. It's a very important ideal for any kind of a saint. This is the absolutely shortest wisdom saying we have from Yeshua. And it's very simple. It says, become ye passers-by. It's reminiscent of Logian 86, which we also find in the Q source in the New Testament. Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man, the Baranash, has nowhere to lay his head. The earth is not ready yet to receive and provide a home for the righteous ones. Disciples must free themselves from attachment to the ways of the world and the flesh and the prince of this world, Shaitan. The essence of this logian is what is known in Buddhism, as I said, as non-attachment. Non-attachment was learned by the Jewish Hakim through the harsh experience of the Jews of the diaspora, whose lives could at any time be turned upside down by the vagaries of their host kingdom. They were no longer in their own sovereign territory. They lived in the sovereign within the sovereignties of other people, and anything could happen. They could be suddenly a pogrom could come down upon them, or they could be suddenly expelled or cast out, or they could be attacked, or bad times could come upon the Jews. And so they had to be non-attached to their wealth and their riches and so on. Like the ancient Hebrew nomads, no matter how secure or welcome and settled they might feel, a time would come when they would need to be travelers once again in search of a homeland. So this is the idea of non-attachment, of becoming passers-by. A very beautiful few paragraphs are written in the Epistle of Diognetus about the Christians becoming who are in many different lands, dressing in the clothing and eating the food of many different nations and peoples, but they themselves have a home somewhere else, not to be attached to the home of the peoples and the nations in which they live, and so on. Yeshua tells his disciples that this is the existential condition of his halakha. The only remedy for impermanence is non-attachment to the illusions of material reality. Now, later on, there would be quite a debate in the early churches about this, what was called the issue of the salvation of the rich man. Remember, Yeshua said that it is harder for a rich man to enter into the Pardes, into the kingdom, into the Malkuth, than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. But yet with God all things are possible. Well, then the question was, should Christians all be poor and give away everything they have? And that is an ascetic version of Christianity, that the Jewish Ebionites followed that maxim. Others did not. Clement of Alexandria writes a beautiful thing on the called on the salvation of the rich man, concerning the salvation of the rich man, and in which he says that non-attachment to wealth and the right use and proper use of wealth is what Yeshua was talking about. Not that one should just become poor and a poor wanderer and a hobo in life and all this sort of thing. Logian 113. This is a wonderful one that I think is very authentic. His disciples said to him, "When will the Malkuth appear on earth?" Jesus answered, "It will not appear by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying it is here or it is there, lo here or lo there. Rather, the Malkuth of the Abba, the kingdom as some people badly translated, or the sovereignty of the Abba, is spread out upon the earth, but mankind does not see it." So this comes at the end of the authentic sayings. There is one more logian. There's a logian in which Peter and his disciple, which Yeshua tells Peter and his disciples that Mary Magdalene, assume that, can become a disciple because he will make her male. That particular logian, Logian 114, is not an original saying of Yeshua, and it's an ascetic saying of the Thomasines when they started admitting women to their groups. But this saying, 113, is the actual true end of the, I believe, of the original Aramaic core of of the Gospel of Thomas. It's a very fitting conclusion to that oral narration of the teachings of Yeshua. It's a summary. It's a kind of quintessential Kabbalistic manda about the advent of the Malkuth and Messiah that Yeshua revealed to his inner circle of Talmidim. They wonder, when is the Messiah going to come? When is the Son of Man going to appear on earth? When is the sovereignty of heaven going to appear on earth? And he says, it's already here. You just can't see it. You have to make yourself able to see it. So that is the ultimate realized eschatology. And I would maintain that was the eschatological view of Yeshua. So this is the final devar of the original Aramaic dictation that began with Login 2, in my opinion. It's a revelation that the Malkuth and the Olam Haba is eternally present. It's mankind who is blind to its realities. Yeshua said the Basor would not be preached to all of Palestine before the Malkuth began to appear to mankind. There were some standing before him who would not taste death, quote, until they see the Malkuth, or until they see the Bar Enosh coming in his sovereignty. And that's the meaning of this. The only modality by which the Bar Enosh would appear on earth to mankind is you will see him coming in the Anani, which is wrongly translated as clouds of heaven. You will see him coming in the mysteries of heaven. And so Yeshua says in the Gospels and other places, no one knows the time or the place. The Malkuth of God, if people tell you, lo here, lo there, do not believe them, because the Malkuth of God is within you, within and beyond. So the Pauline interpretation of this is the clouds of heaven, and that is associated with the idea of a David Messiah. This is part of the Pauline idea of the clouds of heaven and the second coming of Jesus and all this stuff, which is stuff that Yeshua never taught.